ceru, ka tur viss labi strādās. So we will continue with presentation in English. We will talk about youth impact assessment or youth test as we know it in Europe. And later I will invite here participants of discussion, but I think it's nice that we are living in century when we can talk with people even when they are not here in the same place. And today we have an opportunity to talk with OECD policy analyst Gamze Igrioglu. Gamze, do you hear us? Yes, I can hear you. Oh, great. Can you hear me well? Yeah, I hear you very well. Thank you for joining us today. And I think I will be true by saying that today here in the audience are quite many people that will hear about youth test for the first time. So maybe you can introduce us by telling what it is, what's the idea behind that, and how we could practically use it. So.
Thank you so much. Let me first. Analyst on youth and intergenerational justice in the OECD's Public Governance Directorate. And I am really happy to participate in this conference despite being far, as you mentioned, and I hope we will have other occasions to see each other in Riga. In a nutshell, our team works on the question of how governments and public administrations through laws, institutions, public management tools and practices can empower young people and deliver fair policy outcomes for all generations. And as you mentioned, in the next 10-15 minutes, I will try to provide answers to the following questions. What is a youth check or youth test? Why countries choose to use these tools? And how it works in different OECD countries. Next slide, please. Before jumping further into the topic, let me give you a brief overview of OECD's work in this area that we also cover youth check and youth test in these different documents you are seeing now. You are seeing some of the main outputs of our work, and they all start from the observation that sectoral approach is not sufficient to empower young people and promote intergenerational justice. Instead, we look at broader governance arrangements countries have put in place to deliver integrated policies and services to young people. And the report you are seeing, Fit for All Generations, covers evidence from 42 countries and also looks into how youth checks are implemented in different OECD countries. And let me take this opportunity to thank Latvia for participating in this report. And in addition, you are seeing two policy papers that analyze the impact of COVID-19 on young people, one launched at the beginning of the pandemic and one published recently last year. The second paper also maps if and to what extent youth-specific measures are featured in national recovery plans across OECD countries. So building on all these evidence and insights, OECD member countries adopted a recommendation on creating better opportunities for young people that you are seeing on the screen. And this recommendation also suggests all OECD member countries to systematically apply public management tools such as strategic foresight and youth checks to address inequalities across all age groups. So what we are talking about today on youth checks is actually a commitment made by OECD countries to improve outcomes for young people. And with this, let me start by defining what a youth check actually is. Youth check is an impact assessment tool designed to consider the impact of any new policy or legislation on young people. So it helps identify and address different impacts of policy and rulemaking on young people. But why this is needed? In other words, why we need to understand different impacts of policies or legislation specifically on young people. Next slide, please. As you all know, the COVID-19 pandemic is the second shock after the global financial crisis young people experienced in less than 2 decades. And our evidence is clear. Young people today face very specific challenges that may have lasting impact on their trust in government, satisfaction with democracy, and their well-being over their course of life. This chart shows the share of young people across OECD countries that confirm they trust their government as of 2021. And compared to OECD average of 47%, in Latvia, highlighted in green, 42% of young people responded positively to this question. In other words, less than 1 in 2 young people trust their government in OECD countries. The ability and perception of having a say in politics and satisfaction with public services are important areas that drive young people's trust in government. Next slide, please. And as in many areas, COVID-19 pandemic has increased concerns about the effects of public services and how this can be tailored further to address needs of young people. And with a survey we conducted last year, we saw during the course of the pandemic, young people reported decrease of trust in government. And many cited the reason for decline of trust, low levels of satisfaction with public service delivery during the crisis, in particular for young people living in vulnerable circumstances. It also showed us that young people lack opportunities to shape recovery measures, and limited collaboration between governments and civil society influenced their replies. So in this context of low trust, political polarization, these findings need to be taken seriously. They also show we need to better understand the impact of policies, legislation, programs on young people to address many challenges young people face today. Next slide, please. So what are the tools at hand to measure the impact of policies and legislation on young people? In other words, how youth checks can be applied. So one possible way the OECD countries consider to apply youth checks is to adopt national integrated youth strategies. 76% of OECD countries have adopted such strategy. However, only 20% of them are fully participatory, budgeted, monitored, and evaluated. Among OECD countries, Germany included the implementation of its youth check as a key objective of its national youth strategy. German youth check was also prepared in a participatory process together with the National Youth Council of Germany. In Austria, National Youth Council and other youth organizations can submit comments on draft regulation in written format. So this also shows that in addition to assessing the impact of policy and legislation on young people, youth checks also help allowing a participatory process that allows young people to express their views and opinion about new policies or legislation. Next slide, please. Another advantage of youth checks is to help facilitate government coordination by making sure that across all topics relevant for young people, including health, education, housing, environment, and transport, what we do, what governments do not increase inequalities across age groups, but instead mitigate them. Placing young people and their perspective at the center of policymaking requires a whole of government coordinated effort. And this has been confirmed again during the COVID-19 crisis. This slide shows that youth organizations surveyed by the OECD have been rather dissatisfied with the performance of governments to deliver public services during the pandemic across key areas such as sports, culture, leisure, education, housing, and employment. So in this context, this creates the question how policymakers can more systematically embed considerations of young people in policymaking. How we consider their views and perspectives while delivering services, preparing policies and legislation. And in other words, how we can broaden that what we can call the default adult perspective in policymaking. And this brings us to the role of youth checks again. Next slide, please. On this slide, you are seeing the results of the 2020 OECD IREX survey, which asks countries about the areas they look at when conducting such impact assessments. 31 OECD countries are using regulatory impact assessments to assess impact on specific social groups, and 33 countries assess impacts in the area of gender equality. While this slide does not show, more recently, an increasing number of OECD countries have also explored how these tools can be used to anticipate the impact of draft legislation on specific age groups, especially on young people. For instance, the Netherlands has been working on a generation check to anticipate how draft legislation will affect different age cohorts in distinct ways. In Portugal, Gulbenkian Foundation presented a methodology to assess impact of public policies on today's, but also future generations to embed a more long-term perspective in policymaking. And there is a clear business case to do so. First, young people will bear consequences of today's decisions for the longest time. And it is also the case in policy areas with quick turnarounds that are more difficult to achieve, such as environmental and energy policy. Second, in OECD countries in which age-related inequalities are smaller, all citizens of age groups express higher life satisfaction than in countries where there are more differences in the well-being of different age groups. In some countries like the Netherlands, work on these tools have taken this place in response to the calls from the youth-led civil society organizations. At the EU level, you may be aware that European Youth Forum is currently running a collaborative project with the European Commission to put in place an EU youth test for all legislative proposals at EU level. Next slide, please. So to get a comparative overview of current practices, we asked ministries in charge of youth affairs if and how they assess impact of draft legislation on young people. And this slide shows that OECD countries can be categorized into 4 groups. 11 countries indicate that they are not using any mechanism. 3 countries point to ad hoc tools. 8 countries report using standard regulatory impact assessment processes to understand impact on young people. And 4 countries confirm they use youth checks. And motivation behind using youth checks is to encourage collection of evidence that is available per age group and contribute to better decision making. The second reason why these countries are using youth checks is to anticipate potentially negative impacts of any policy or legislation before they create unwanted effects or costs on young people. Third reason is what I already mentioned, to foster interministerial coordinations in areas that may otherwise appear less relevant to the lives of young people. Fourth reason is raise interest in politics among young people and youth organizations and wider civil society, and increase transparency and accountability of the process and policy outcomes. Next slide, please. This slide provides a brief overview of youth checks or similar tools that are currently used in OECD countries. Let me just briefly point to some of the main differences that we can absorb across these different approaches. First concerns the scope of application. For example, in Germany, youth check is applied for legislative proposals that are initiated by a federal ministry, but not when the proposal is initiated by the parliament. The other difference is the age group. In Austria, the youth checks cover children and young adults aged 0 to 30. In a Flemish community in Belgium, they cover individuals below 25 years old, and in France, youth check applies to young people between 16 and 25. So there are also differences in respect to which age groups to consider while using this tool. The third is the criteria, or what we call threshold of application. So when you use a youth check, you need to know under which criteria you should use this tool to avoid burdensome administrative processes. And the OECD recommendation on regulatory policy and governance says that these impact assessments, youth checks, should be applied based on a proportionate approach. In other words, it may not be feasible to conduct a sophisticated impact assessment for every new draft legislation. In Flanders, new legislation must have direct influence on young people to be considered eligible for a youth check. In Austria, youth check is applied if at least 10,000 children and young people are likely to be affected by the proposed legislation. Beyond these three quick examples, youth checks also differ in terms of legal basis, the entity conducting the check, and differences also exist when to conduct this assessment. Is it before the legislation is prepared? Is it in the course of amendments? And at which stage young people can participate in the process, and to which extent the results of youth checks are published and disseminated. So all these differences also show us there is no one approach or silver bullet to adopt a youth check that can fulfill all the criteria in all the same way in any country. We really need to assess the needs on the ground to understand what you want to achieve by adopting a youth check, and then tailor a country-specific approach to make sure that it is working in its best way. So I'm looking forward to today's discussion to elaborate more on these topics and also hear the perspectives from Latvia about these tools. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gamze, for this presentation. So we will continue with discussion about possibilities to implement this kind of tool in Latvia. So I will invite the following experts to join me here on the stage. So please, Deputy State Secretary of the Latvian Ministry of Education and Science, Director of Political Initiatives and Development Department, Ilze Saliniece. The State Chancellery Consultant for Good Governance Affairs, Ines Kušķe, and the National Youth Council of Latvia and European Economic and Social Committee representative, Katrīna Leitāne. Please here, take your seats. So, good morning, or maybe I could say good afternoon right now. The first question is quite general, and I will ask it to all the participants. So, what are your thoughts on the pros and also on cons of building such tool here in Latvia, or maybe in general? So, if you're ready to answer, you can share your thoughts. Is it working? Yeah.
Is it working? Okay, shall I start?
Of course.
First of all, I would like to thank my dear colleagues Randa Ķeņģe and Renāta Menzendorfa, who are, let's say, the driving force behind this idea, and who during the summer of the European Youth Year have really actively discussed about youth test potential implementation in Latvia. So thank you, Randa and Renāte. Talking about advantages, in the previous sessions we talked a lot about youth participation in decision making. I think this is, let's say, the best form and most proactive form how youngsters can actually participate in decision making, and in my opinion it's very important, because quite often we emphasize and we talk about youngsters being decision makers. So this initiative actually allows them and gives them really practical tools how they can really become decision makers. So that's definitely one benefit. Secondly, if I think about public sector and the policies we, in our everyday work, we establish and build, policies, different legal projects, it is very important that they are high quality. And by high quality, I mean that they are represented by the audience, which will make an impact on this particular group. So I think for us as civil servants, it is very important to have processes and policies and laws that are really allowing the target groups they are meant for to have better opportunities. So I would start with these two advantages, and then I'll pass to my colleagues to add some more.
Thank you very much. How about others?
Yes, hello. So I'm representing the State Chancellery, and one of our key roles is to promote citizen engagement in the decision-making process, especially in the decisions that are taken by the Cabinet of Ministers. And I have different specific points that I will maybe then make later, but for a general introduction, of course, no doubt, I join what the previous speaker said, that it's important to involve any society in the group that is the target audience of the legal act or the policy to be developed by the ministry or the public agency. So we would support that, but we also think that we need to find this group. So I think it's a challenge how to find the young people in daily work of the public institution through an NGO or individually by, for example, survey, etc. So that's probably a challenge. But certainly it can be solved, just pointing it out. But otherwise, such involvement will allow to have a data-driven decision and also a decision that is based on the experience, but also the habits of this target group. So it certainly have more benefits. So yeah, but I will then present more specific details later in the discussion.
Okay, so last but not least, hopefully. So first of all, good morning to all of you. And I would like to thank also to the Ministry of Education and Science for holding this discussion specifically on the youth test, because I think it's really a timely topic since we are still in the European Year of Youth. And there's a need for concrete steps to ensure a long-lasting legacy of the European Year of Youth. Just very briefly about the opinion adopted by the Economic and Social Committee on the EU Youth Test. So basically, it is an impact assessment tool to make sure that all policy making at EU level is seen through a youth lens. And it is based on 3 pillars: meaningful engagement, impact assessment, and mitigation measures. And it is also built on key objectives of the European Year of Youth, EU Youth Strategy, and it also is one of the proposals outlined during the Conference on the Future of Europe. So, but if you're asking about pros and cons, to sum up, I would say that there are 2 main advantages. It builds trust, since if you are generally involved in decision-making process and your views have been taken into account in building that decision, you are more likely to support it later on as well. And secondly, you get better decisions because if you involve those people who are most impacted by that decision, these are the best people to tell you what this decision will mean, and it's also an opportunity to spot unintended consequences of those decisions. And one con I want to mention, this tool should not substitute meaningful engagement with young people in general. It should only complement existing participatory mechanisms.
Thank you very much. Maybe Gamze, do you want to add something to your colleagues on this question?
Yes, I fully agree with what was mentioned as advantages of this tool. And definitely it is a way of making more informed decisions. Because to be able to use a tool like this, you really need the evidence to be able to assess if it fulfills the threshold criteria to have a significant impact on young people. And then you need evidence to guide and then apply the tool. So it makes more informed decisions in advance before a draft regulation takes this differentiated impact, and then have addressed them in the course of the regulation making. In that sense, it is resonating with more informed decision making aspect, but also what I mentioned earlier, it also brings together all ministries and all stakeholders together. To be able to implement a tool like this, you need ownership from all ministries, and you need to assess in each sectoral area how impacts on young people are assessed. So it also fosters collaboration and makes sure that in each area, from environment to transport to housing, we are making sure that whatever legislation is proposed, whatever policy is being made, it is responsive to young people and it promotes intergenerational fairness. And it is also a way of meaningful engagement. One of the ways to collect this age disaggregated evidence is to also consult young people and to understand their circumstances. So it's not definitely a substitute, but rather a complementary approach to participatory processes.
If we think about this use test in Latvia, and I think we all can think about it very well, how could it practically work here? And maybe this side question, what would be required of policymakers and how not to increase the administrative burden? Maybe Ilse, I'm looking to you. Maybe you are the best who can answer to this.
Yes, thank you. First of all, it's very important to identify key stakeholders in the process of establishing use test. And I would say that 3 of us is let's say the ultimate starting point, but this is just the starting point. We need, first of all, the rest of the ministries involved in the processes, and also, of course, youth organizations and other institutions involved in, let's say, this process. But us 3 could be the starting point to start a discussion about it. So I would say that the first key step would be among stakeholders to agree on the implementation mechanism. What do we understand by the use check, first of all, and how do we implement it? And definitely, if I think about administrative burden, one of really practical comments I would like to make is that we definitely should start smart and small, maybe pilot it, perhaps on a municipal level, or maybe in one certain area, and perhaps avoid big ambitious changes, which are system changes at the very first moment. I would suggest that we start with small pilot, with experiment, we gather data, we understand who are the involved parties, how is the best to establish the process, and then we think about systemic processes, because indeed we can, in a way, spoil a very, very good idea and initiative if we do the implementation in the wrong way, because you mentioned this administrative burden. It is really a high risk. In Latvian, we say it darīt ķeksīša pēc, vai to do it in a really formal way. So I would see this as the biggest risk in this process, that with not very clever and just for the sake of doing it approach, we can actually not benefit from the rich results that this initiative can bring. So this would be my 2 points for the start of the discussion.
Thank you very much. Ines, maybe you want to continue on this, and maybe you can tell a little bit more what could promote or delay the implementation in Latvia, if you think about that more.
Well, I'm not such a big expert to tell about what can delay or promote in general, but I can highlight that already today we have a regulation in force about impact assessment. So the ex ante or the initial impact assessment is regulated, and there are several areas that shall be assessed by the author of a policy or legal act before it is submitted to the cabinet. For example, impact on health, on environment, on the economy, etc. There are at least 10 points that already are listed in this regulation. So I looked at what social groups are mentioned, and there are actually 2. One is the people who are at risk to be socially excluded, and diaspora, so the Latvians living abroad. So we could include youth. It could be the 3rd social group that should be paid special attention to. There are also guidelines how to make this impact assessment that are developed by the State Chancellery and are available on our special website for the development of legal acts. So we could then update these guidelines and include a section on youth test, which should include the description of the process, or at least some principles how to carry out such test. And then as last point, we have several activities for awareness raising. For example, this year we started public participation afternoons 2 times a year for each ministry representatives coming together. So we could spend some time describing this new tool and inviting them to carry it out. And I really liked Il's proposal that we could first test it. For example, next year, each ministry could take the commitment, if they agree with me. Here I'm just speaking loudly, but I think it's not so difficult to do this use test based on some common principles. I think we should start by that maybe, and do it, let's say, once in one policy document that directly affects use, or where it's very clear that use is part of this person's affected. And then at the end of next year, we could think, you know, how actually we should establish then in the long term this new impact test. Thank you.
Just a very short remark. I think if there's a will, there's always a way, right? So I think what Ilse already mentioned, so we can see the beginning of this road, and I think it's a good, because that's the aim we are seeing, and we are heading to it. And as we can see, the experiences varies across member states regarding methodology, regarding approaches, regarding who is conducting actually this impact assessment or doing the questionnaire or checklist. So we can all these aspects can be discussed at the table, but I think the most important thing is to get at this table and to start this discussion.
Thank you. Maybe Gamze, do you have any comments or suggestions for implementation process in Latvia?
I think all ideas mentioned were extremely relevant, including piloting at a smaller scale. We see that some countries started with small pilots to get earlier lessons learned and to update the tool if needed. So I think that's a very good idea. Another point mentioned by Inese is to see whether this can be integrated in the existing regulatory impact assessment process, or if it is better to have this as a separate tool. I think that's also a very interesting area to consider early on, whether this can be already included in the existing process, or if it is better to have it as a tool that would be really implemented separately. And then all these points I mentioned regarding what is the scope of application, in which circumstances this tool should be applied, what is the age group that needs to be considered. There are all these different methodologies, as I mentioned, in OECD countries. So perhaps one aspect is to also to learn from other member countries, from their experience of going through the similar process. And we would be, of course, very happy to facilitate this exchange and then to see what would be the most suitable in the case of Latvia. But I fully agree that when designed well and prepared based on the needs and objectives, instead of creating administrative burden, it can actually address many of the challenges and improve outcomes for young people.
Small and smart, but in general, what do you think? What are your thoughts about applying this use test to all legal acts, or should we make some exceptions? Sorry.
I think it really depends on the objective that that is being achieved. We see in some countries this is mandatory for every legislation. For example, in Canada, they have gender-based analysis plus tool, and the name says gender, but actually this tool looks at gender, race, age, disability, and various other diversity indicators in a one compact tool, and it is mandatory for all new legislation to be applied. And this is overseen by an independent oversight institution to make sure that all draft legislation is accompanied by correct assessment. In France, it is possible that this is mandatory also for all new legislation, and it is possible that draft legislation might be turned by the parliament if the impact assessment is not done well. So these are options that are applying more in a holistic perspective for every new legislation. And then we have other examples, like in Germany, it is more a project-based, depending on the topic that is most relevant to young people, then they conduct a very sophisticated analysis. Or the example I mentioned about Austria, to make sure that at least 10,000 young people are affected, to be able to conduct this analysis, to make sure that there is a criteria and scope of application. So I think what is important here is that to best understand what will be the legal basis for using such tools, which purposes this tool will serve, how complicated it would be to apply to every new legislation, but rather maybe start with establishing a certain threshold and then to see if it is responding well to the challenges and if it is working well. And then if needed, this can be also broadened, of course. But in many cases, before coming up with tools like the Canada used, they also had many smaller examples at the beginning before coming up with such integrated tool that looks at all diversity factors, for example. So I really agree with the approach to look at the current regulatory processes and then to see if it can be integrated into that. If it is a separate tool, how to start at a smaller scale, and then based on lessons learned, if there is need to broaden it maybe to a greater amount of legislation.
Very much, Gamze. I see Katrina is something to add.
I will just add, for instance, in case of the EU use test, our vision is to integrate this in the better regulation toolbox as a separate tool. So let's see how it would go in case of Latvia. But if you're asking about applying this tool in all policy fields, I would say that majority of topics in today's world are so complex and so interlinked that eventually it's really hard to say which one is not related to youth at the end and also to the generations to come, because we have to remember that there are generations to come and we have to be responsible to those decisions made today. And because I think that even indirect effect can still have a direct relevance to young people and generations to come. So in my perspective, this tool should be applied in all policy fields.
Okay, maybe do you think the same, or you have some other comments?
I would still stick to my small and smart idea. I would see as long-term vision, it could be all legal acts, because one perhaps extra thought and extra dimension I would like to highlight, in order to have really high quality implementation of use test, it's very important that we have the necessary skills, competencies, who are actually able to deliver data on a particular legal act or policy. For example, what I have seen in Germany, this function is of how to say, implementing use test is given to an independent body who is first of all research organization. And they have professional researchers who are specializing in law, social studies, etc., who are gathering data on use matters. And only then, and because of that, the policy makers and decision makers regards particular law are able to take really informed and high quality decision making. So I would say, in my opinion, of course, that we would need to make, let's say, the house in order to have really high quality partners who are gathering this data. Let's start with some policies, let's check it. Perhaps the first step, as Ines has suggested, is to look at the current impact assessment system, and maybe that's really the first initial stage, and then move step by step slowly. So I wouldn't perhaps be so bold, but since my colleague is from youth organization, kind of it fits our, let's say position. But as a public sector representative, I would say let's test and then move forward.
Thank you very much. We are quite short of time today, and it's very good that we already started. You already started discussion, and we continue this today. And of course, we need to continue it in the future. But maybe we can end with some inspiration. And if we think about introduction of this kind of tool in Latvia, what do you think? What changes would it bring, and what would be the biggest benefit to society, especially young people? Katrin, maybe we can start with you.
Okay, so I think political participation is a basis for every functioning democracy. And there are a couple of numbers I want to mention concerning youth. So as we saw from Randa's presentation, young people make up 12% of the whole population. The average age of a member at national parliament and also in the local governments varies from 46 to 50. Also, if we ask young people, how do you think you can influence decisions made in the local government, they say it's only 14%, and also at national level it's only 8%. So I think we have to be frank with ourselves that these participatory mechanisms which are in place are not efficient enough to take on board opinions of young people, because they are underrepresented in political processes and also in the consultation processes. So, but also there's one more thing I want to mention, because definition of the political participation transformed the problem of young people participation from whether they participate to where they participate. So I think it's a time for a paradigm shift, how we include young people and how they are involved in decision-making processes and policy-making processes. So I think that the mechanisms we offer at the moment, they should be tailored specifically to the needs of young people, so we can hear them. And I think it's good to hear Ilse's position that you are willing to speak about this tool, and I'm happy to share my experience to introduce it in Latvia.
Thank you, Katrīna. Inese.
Well, I'm happy too that there will be this new tool to assess impact, because we speak quite a lot about data, the importance of using, gathering data to explore the opinions of citizens and users, etc. In our new draft modernization plan of public administration and generally in daily life in state chancery, I think this is a topic of importance. So this is just a way to do that, to connect with our society, and because young people are like other social groups, they have their experiences and they use public services, probably more digital services, and they have also their habits in life that they could share with us as the government, and so I'm happy that there will be this corridor to connect us with the society, which is very important to increase trust, which is one of the lowest in Latvia compared to other OECD countries. So I'm looking forward to meet more young people next year. I commit to talk about it with ministries in our public participation afternoon. Hopefully at the end of this year we'll organize one. So I hope Ilse will come and support us, and next year there will be more young people. Hopefully there are young people who want to come. Sometimes our participation activities are not very exciting, so I think we should think about what ways, what forms of participation we propose. Probably not writing an opinion on a legal act, maybe something more interactive. But, well, as you said, if we want, we can get there. So, yeah, I wish we do more next year. Yeah.
Yeah, and to continue on your thought about inspiration, I think inspirational is this discussion, because this is really indeed the first time when we are, first of all, us three coming together and really discussing this. And in this really participatory way, we are opening discussion for all of you, because here in the audience we have youngsters and we also have other ministries. So this is an invitation to continue this discussion and debate, how, when we can really implement use test in Latvia. And secondly, also what Ines has said, it is very important to hear youngsters' opinion on what could be the potential format of this use test. So again, so that it's not again something that is kind of boring and old schoolish. So it's very important to hear your opinion, not only about particular policies, but how this process should be managed. And as regards inspiration for my individual work, I represent public sector today, and I'm interested in working in really modern, how to say, 21st century public sector. And I think this is definitely one of the ways how I can see this could become true, because we are building policies and laws for audiences, not for ourselves. And this is the way how we can actually involve the audiences that these laws and policies are made for in active process, so that we are not making them for youngsters, but together with youngsters in this particular case. And these two thoughts are really inspirational for me. Thank you.
For me too. Thank you. Gamze, do you want to add something in the end?
Just also thank you for hosting this meeting. It was also quite interesting to see this motivation and ambition to implement this tool. Latvia is definitely a country that is doing really well in OECD indicators for young people, but we also see that in the current context, many young people are facing very specific challenges, from climate change to the recovery from COVID-19. And with this in mind, many countries are looking for ways to support young people, and Youth Check is definitely a very helpful tool to make sure that we are delivering tailored services for young people. They receive the support they need while transitioning to adulthood, but also they are satisfied with policies, outcomes. They have to increase their trust in government, strengthen their relationship with democracy and democratic processes. So I see this as a tool that can fulfill really multidimensional objectives. And I'm very happy to continue also our collaboration with the counterparts we discussed today about mobilizing the best evidence and good practices from other OECD countries. Thank you.
I will say thank you to all the participants for this first big public discussion about youth test in Latvia. Especially thank you, Gamze, for joining us today. I want to just repeat what already Katrin said, that it's a possibility to shift our paradigms, and we will shift. I really hope that. So thank you all again. If you want to discuss more about that you have a possibility to find us in the lunch break. So yeah, that's all for this discussion. Thank you very much. Un, lai pārtrauktu šo neveiklo klusumu pauzi, tiešām paldies par šo pirmo mūsu mēģinājumu diskutēt par šo. Manuprāt, kad es vakardien pirmo reizi mēģināju iepazīties ar diezgan sarežģīto procesu un terminu, droši, jā, atvainojiet, pārtraucu jūs došanos projām, bet tik tiešām